I could probably take 45 minutes up just talking about Helena, and would get great pleasure in doing that, because she is this wonderful powerhouse of a woman that has got extensive experience in the world of human rights. It's a real privilege to have Helena with us today. She is the patron of the Helena Kennedy Centre for International Justice. She's also the Chancellor at Sheffield Hallam University. And if that wasn't enough for Helena, she's also the director of the Human Rights Institute at the International Bar Association, where she's been for the last couple of years now. And she's also a Labour peer in the House of Lords, and engages in a number of different activities across the globe. She has been working as a human rights lawyer, champion, advocate, activist, I would say probably for the last 5 decades now, Helena. I was like, when I was looking at your profile, I was like thinking, gosh, that's an incredible CV of activities.
I'm embarrassed to say that this year is my anniversary of 50 years practice at the bar. So it's been a long time, and it means that I have many decades of experience. But although I have acted in many national security cases, terrorism cases, challenging the law around forced confessions and many different things involving accused who are in extremis and facing very difficult charges, men and women. Women often where they've killed abusive partners after many years of domestic violence and abuse. Although I've done all those things, one of the things I love most is the opportunity of sharing some of that experience with other people in parts of the world. And I've learned from many other women, from their own experiences, and I continue to learn. So despite having been 50 years in practice, I'm still learning. So it's a great privilege to be here with you today. And of course, Suni's work I admire enormously, because training our police in how to approach cases when all of our societies are so patriarchal that very often policing itself fails to understand and acknowledge the ways in which women's experience is different, and how women have difficulty in giving voice to what they may have happened to them, for example, sexually, when they've been violated, and the training that Suni does with police officers, for example, in India, is just wonderful, and I want to pay tribute to it. She's a source of great admiration from me, and I just can't pay tribute enough to the good and solid work that she does. So I'm very happy to be with all of you today, and share my meager bits of knowledge with all of you, and thoughts at this point. Do you want me to kick off, Suni? I'd rather that than that you spent lots of time talking.
Absolutely, but before you do, I think for us, you are the greatest role model of feminism and human rights that there can be globally, which is why we wanted you to kick off this conference. And in a time where we have got human rights being challenged globally, and particularly that impact on women and girls, sometimes it can feel quite despairing and quite bleak. And for us, we really want to have some of those moments of hope to say, actually, collectively, there is some fantastic work going on across the globe. And it is challenging, but certainly in all the years that I've followed you and have personally got to know you, you have been a great source of support and inspiration to me. So a lot of the work that I've been able to do and have been privileged to do has been because I've learned and have been inspired and have been encouraged by the wonderful work of yourself and others as well. So this platform is really about us coming together and having those glimmers of hope of what we can do collectively. And what a fantastic way to start by having you here. So thank you, Helena, because I know how busy you are, for making the time to inspire us, because when you talk, people listen and people do feel inspired. So on that note, I will hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Suni. I've actually just come, I'm here in London, but I've just come back down from Scotland, where I went up for 24 hours. Scotland is where I come from, as many of you will know. And I went back because the Scottish government had invited me over this last year to review the issue of misogyny and whether there was any way in which the Scottish legal system should look at how it worked to address the issue of misogyny in Scottish society. Now, let me tell you, Scottish society is no different from society anywhere else. And in all of our societies, unfortunately, misogyny is still a serious issue. We've just had here in the UK, in our parliament, a suggestion being made that one of the leading women politicians on the opposition benches deliberately crosses her legs in order to distract the Prime Minister when he's trying to deal with serious issues. So, you know, here is the suggestion being made that men are victims to their own sort of sexual desires and lust. And here is an attractive woman on the opposition benches, and because she occasionally crosses her legs, is obviously a woman using her sexuality to undermine menfolk. And you would have thought that by the time we got into the 21st century and here in 2022 that we had stopped saying ridiculous and daft things like that. But no, it's still going on, and it's a way of undermining women and suggesting that we drive men to bad things. Anyway, what can I tell you? The reason I was in Scotland, as I was saying, was because I was there. I had issued a report, and I hope some of you will take a look at it, because it's a very progressive report in which I'm looking at the issue of misogyny and how, when misogyny is behind crimes that are committed against women, it's about concentrating minds as to whether misogyny is present, whether it's being done to a woman because she's a woman. And sometimes assaults on women or threatening behavior towards women, things that are happening increasingly online towards women. They are actually, part of a sort of misogynistic desire by men to retain primacy over women. It's a sort of backlash that we're seeing, and it started, I'm afraid that that technology has been part of the problem here, because it's always existed, but social media has given a megaphone to some of this stuff and disinhibited people from saying you deserve to be raped, and somebody should come around and rape you. And of course, what this does to us as women is that it reinforces that fear that we have, and that is inculcated in us since from the age of 8 and 9, that our mothers tell us be fearful and careful of men because they may try to sexually interfere with you. You could become pregnant and so on. And so the anxiety about that lives somewhere in our hearts, and can easily be stimulated and therefore have a chilling effect on us, so that we start in restricting our own aspirations and the things that we might do, because we have to be self-protective, self-safeguarding, and women spend their lives doing that. Choosing not to go down certain streets, choosing always to be with another person late in the evening, all those things that women find themselves having to do to self-protect. Now, I mention all of that because we're here talking particularly about gender, climate change and security, because of the challenges that there are in our contemporary world, which have a particular impact on women. Almost invariably, when there's conflict, where there is any kind of crisis or any sort of chaos, women bear special, a heightened brunt of all of that, because of course they almost always are still the primary carers of children. The loss for them is often of a different kind and not taken into the calculations of war or conflict or climate change, the ways in which there are special impacts on the lives of women. And that has always been so until women became a bit more vocal, and education has been an enabler for all of that. But education is still, of course, something that we're scrambling for to make it available to all women and girls around the world, because so many still don't have those opportunities. But I do think that when it comes to the issue of climate change, there are not enough women at the tables, and there are not enough women at the places where decisions are being made. And while we've got Greta Thunberg doing her thing, I'm afraid that when it comes to the business of power broking, there isn't, we know that the business of power is something that is yet to come seriously into the hands of women. Now, you can't talk about anything, and all of us know this, without sometimes putting on those spectacles, which are our own gendered, developed understanding of where power lies in society and how it isn't in the hands of women when we come to look at all the policy issues that arise in our societies. We keep being told that somehow or other we've now achieved, we've got there. Women are now equal, or, that's what we keep being told. And we know it isn't true. This is unfinished business. The business of achieving equality for women as equal human beings, equal in dignity and in rights, that we aren't there yet. And so we've got to keep reminding ourselves that there's a way to go. Some of us have been fortunate and have been privileged in having the educational opportunities that have given us a chance to actually aspire to certain things. And of course, I feel very privileged that I became a lawyer. I ended up in my years of practice at the bar doing many challenging and interesting cases, and in the end became a Queen's Counsel. And I've now, nothing surprises me more than the fact that I'm in the House of Lords, that I'm a parliamentarian, not a politician, I always point out, but a parliamentarian, someone who is involved in seeking to improve law as it passes through our parliamentary system. But I've never stood for election. In our democratic system, I'm there by virtue of appointment, and that is a privileged position. And so I use that platform to argue for women's rights, for changes in the law, reform of the law where it might be possible, in order to advance the case of women and of girls. But we still know that equality is not there, and we've got to continue with the struggle to achieve it. Now, one of the things that we all have to recognize is that women to this day are still the primary carers of children, and they're still subject to male entitlement, a sense of male entitlement to our bodies, but also male entitlement to care from us, attention from us. In the evidence that I was just hearing in Scotland from the many women and women's organisations who gave evidence to the commission I was heading up, was about how so often aggression from men towards women derives from women not paying enough attention to them. Women will be at a bus stop or sitting on a bus, and a man starts talking to her and wanting her attention, and when she isn't responsive to his interest in her, then suddenly it turns nasty and it turns into aggressive behavior, which in turn makes a woman fearful. She's then worried about, if I get off the bus, will he follow me? Will he find out where I live? Will there be consequences to this? And so, and that business of somehow the male ego feeling affronted, arising out of a sense of male entitlement, which again goes back to the ways in which we as men and women are reared and to believe what is our proper place in society. And part of misogyny nowadays is not about hating women, it's about trying to keep women, maintain the primacy of men and the male entitlement that there is, and to make sure that women remain in their position, to know their place. And so it's so often women as journalists, women as people who go into politics, women who put their head above the parapet as campaigners, women who somehow seek to go beyond that which is somehow deemed appropriate for us, that those women particularly reap the whirlwind of social media comment and threat and so on, and the abuse that there is online it can be horrifying. But the disinhibition that has allowed that has now travelled onto the streets, so that women going about their daily business can be subjected to incredible abusive behaviour. Now, I mention all of that because it would be delusional for us not to recognize the extent of the power imbalance that there is in all of our societies, and to recognize the ways in which that power imbalance continues, so that women are not at the tables of power, not at the peacemaking places, not at in the places where decisions are so often made about how we address climate change. And the absence of women in laws making has been one of the things that I've done battle with over the years, because law is so vital in all of this space. You know, law is something that is one of the tools that is fundamental if you want to create cultural change and attitudinal change. Now, a number of years ago, I was asked, I was invited in by the International Bar Association to become the chair, in fact, of the Institute of Human Rights. And a presidential task force was created at the time by the then president of the International Bar Association, and it was on climate change and human rights. And it was a response to a challenge made by Mary Robinson, who had been the president of Ireland, who'd been a speaker at one of the great conferences organized by the International Bar Association. And she'd said, lawyers should be looking at this. The work should be done on this around how do you use law as a tool for this change. And so I was one of the co-chairs on a report that came out of the International Bar Association on climate change and human rights. And one of the things that became very clear in all of that was just how the disruptions would impact on the lives of human beings the world over, but how privileged the global North is as against the global South, and how the burden of change has to be fairly distributed. And you know, is it any wonder that the poor of the world look at their television screens and their iPhone screens, because of course the technology has spread everywhere and has enriched the few. But the many are looking in their screens and they're seeing people living lives that are dreamlike for the many. And they say, so why shouldn't we be able to have some of those things, those cars, those air-conditioned homes, all those things that, of course, are the creators of the pollution and of the climate change that is going to beleaguer our world in the years to come. And so for the global North to be telling those in the global South, or to be telling the poor of the world, you have to change your ways, is a bit rich when we've enjoyed so much comfort and so much indulgence for so long. And so part of this, of course, inevitably, therefore, has to be about social justice too. And so you can't talk about women's equality, climate change, any of these big subjects without looking beyond to the social justice implications of this, and how the burden has to be shared and shared fairly. And the rich world has the biggest bit of sharing to do, in my view, of any. Now, we know what climate change is doing, and there's been so much denial for so long, but thank God we seem to have reached a point where nobody is any longer, or nobody, of course there are some people, but there is a consensus around the fact that climate change is a grievous challenge to the globe, with rising seas, with deserts expanding in the hottest parts of the world, with the whole business of aridity, meaning that you can't grow crops, that people are having problems with scraping together a livelihood in parts of the world, but also the ways in which rising seas are driving people from coastlines. And so the movement of people, the displacement of people is huge and will be even greater. And already you see the rich world closing its doors. And I've just had the personal experience of this, because I was very involved in the evacuation of women judges and lawyers and prosecutors, women from Afghanistan, because they were on death lists, were on kill lists of the Taliban, because of the very fact that they dared to move into the public arena, that they were sitting as judges, that they were publicly prosecutors, they were women who had professional lives, but were taking part in the building of a society and creating the rule of law and protecting women. I mean, what had happened was that after the Taliban were ousted last time round, we International Bar Association and the institute that I was involved in creating a bar association in Afghanistan, and we were insisting that women had to be part of this profession. That law had to reflect the society, and you needed women to be making law, to be part of the people who were adjudicating and making judgments that could be trusted by society. And we wanted the law schools to open their doors to women. And that happened. And wonderful women then stepped forward. And when in 2009, Afghanistan adopted the UN Convention on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, encouraged, of course, by, all of us, those women basically were the people who ran those courts that had the evidence of domestic violence, of rape, of forced marriage, of child marriage, all that stuff that beleaguers women and that destroys their lives. And those women, then of course, once the Taliban returned, those women had to be put back in their box or eliminated. And the women were wanting to flee for their lives. They were living in basements. They were in terror. And I was receiving calls from them. And so I went about the business of evacuating them. I raised the money. I chartered aeroplanes and got those women into safe houses, and then got them transferred using, without giving away some of the stuff that I can't talk about, but with the help on the ground, security was provided to get them to the airport. And we then, over 3 flights, over a period of a month, we evacuated 103 women judges, 510 people, because their husbands and their children came with them, and we got them out. Now, I can't pretend to you it was easy, and there were times when I cried because of the problems that arose, and the times when I couldn't get some of the people out. But I can tell you this, the biggest shock to my life was that I assumed that when I got them to a lily pad, a kind of temporary landing place, which was Athens, I thought that the world would open its arms and that countries would say, of course we'll take in these women judges, these brave women. And I couldn't find places for them to go, to be resettled. The doors were closed, and countries didn't want to take them, and including my own. And so that was the biggest shock of all of this to me. Was I knew what the Taliban would do, but what I didn't know was that the world would not embrace people fleeing persecution. And that was a shock to me. And let me tell you, it's the shock and the worry and anxiety that I have about climate change, because as people move, countries will put up the barriers to keep them out as people flee from the rising tides and the inability to survive in places that have become flooded or become so arid that they can't even grow the food that they need to live. And so the Refugee Convention, in preparing the report for the International Bar Association on climate change and human rights, it became very clear to us that the Refugee Convention provides no succor to people fleeing climate change, because of course the purpose of the Refugee Convention was about fleeing war or fleeing persecution. And so it doesn't provide you with the sustenance that you need and the protection that people need from climate change. And we know that, of course, climate change is also giving rise to internal conflicts in places. Once resources are scarce, whether it's water or whether it's resources that have great value, earth minerals, diamonds, people seek the things that might enrich them. But once those conflicts, once resources become scrambled over, then inevitably you end up having civil wars, you end up having conflict, and again, the movement of people, and also women suffer. women so often are the people who are left behind, or the women who the people who have to flee with their child on their back. Mother courage. They end up being the people often who end up being violated, raped. One of the areas of my work just now, I've just been put on to a task force by the Ukraine Prosecutor General, along with Amal Clooney and a number of international lawyers from the UK, United States, France, different places. And we're working on war crimes. Now, my area, which I have been working on and which I have some expertise in now, is around the violence inflicted on women in war and in conflict, because so often the way that you punish a people is by violating their womenfolk, and the suffering of women in wartime, and we're hearing accounts of this, testimonies of this already from Ukraine. But by God, I've heard the testimonies of it from many different places. And as a woman listening to another woman telling their accounts of what they've suffered, I also have spent time with Dr. Mukwege, who won the Nobel Prize for his work in the Congo. He's a Congolese doctor, an obstetrician gynecologist, and he basically has spent a large part of his life working on repairing the physical mutilation of women's genitalia and the things that were done to them and the damage that was done to them physically by multiple rapes. And he spoke to me about trying to get psychological help for the women, and then how what he feels he can't repair is that hole in the hearts of those women where they haven't had any justice, where they cannot have the solace of somehow a repairing that you need to feel whole again when someone has totally violated your being. And so we've got to understand that climate change will bring about, if we do not act soon and really take the seriousness of this into account, the consequences, the ripple-on effect is going to be enormous. And it's not just going to be the flooding and the fires and the destruction of an environment and all of that. Yes, those things will cause a great deal of loss of life, but it's the other stuff that leads from it too. The scramble for survival and the conflicts that will derive from it, and how we know in our hearts, we know the prices borne by women in that circumstance. Their children torn from them, their children killed, their menfolk and families killed. I've been recently involved in the putting together cases that we might be able to take to international courts for the Yazidi women, the women who in northern Iraq, where a genocide essentially took place, perpetrated by ISIL, but allowed to happen by other nations in the region. Syria, Iraq, Turkey, allowed that to happen. And those women multiply raped, and the consequences for them, their mental health, the destruction of their communities, being impregnated and giving birth to babies who were their only source of love and comfort at the time. And then their families not wanting to embrace the children who were the children of the people who slaughtered so many of their people, the beheading of their men and boys, as well as the raping of their women. So I do urge all of you in your discussions today to bear in mind that there are serious issues here that we're having to address, and we haven't touched yet below the real surface issues that are going to affect our world. And so all I would say to everybody is that the issue of gender rights, and climate change and security and the insecurity that comes for women who are so often the keepers of the family, what happens when this kind of threat is posed to our world. So I want to wish you well in your discussions for the rest of the day, and to say that I think there are a few things more important for us to be addressing at the moment. Obviously, there's the whole business of the war and the conflicts around the world, the rise of populism and how that is degrading the politics of our world, and how inevitably that involves serious trashing of rights of men and women and children. But discussing today the rights of women, this is unfinished business, and we've got a lot of work still to do. How can I give you hope? Suni wanted me to give you hope. In 50 years of practicing at the bar, I've seen lots of change. And one of the great changes that has taken place is that women have gained so much, even in those 50 years. So many more women having the advantage of education and educational opportunities which women are taking. And it's as if we've been thirsty for so long that this drink has at last come, and we now can flourish in the pleasure of learning. And taking that learning into spaces where we can enjoy some level of power, where we can make change and can argue for change. And to find male colleagues to come on board in that process. And I do think that you can count the fact that much has taken place in those 50 years. When you're young, as most of you are, 50 years feels like a very long time. When you are my age, 50 years suddenly doesn't seem like that long at all. It happened very quickly. And so I can say to you, each of you will put your brick into this new edifice, a better world. And we can change things, and things will change. It will not always remain like this, but there is an urgency. There's an urgency around this issue of climate change, and we have to have our voices heard, and we have to play our part in really seeking to address it for our future generations, as well as everyone else. And in law, advances are being made. People are challenging their governments. There was the great gender litigation which started off in Holland, where citizens groups took their government and said, "What are you doing? You made commitments on climate change and on lowering our emissions. Are you achieving them? Are you doing enough?" And it's gone all the way to their Supreme Court successfully. And other citizens organizations in other parts of the world are doing the same. And the other thing that's happening is that there is now litigation being looked at, which is about the protection of the rights of future generations. And so there's imaginative work being done in the field of law about how law can be used as a tool in this whole struggle. So I want to start this conference by saying, important work. All of you have a contribution to make. Thank you very much for inviting me to start you off. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helena. That was wonderful, and certainly given us food for thought that there has been progress along the way over the past 50 years. So as much as we can despair and cry, and I know how much you've tirelessly worked over the past few months with not just Afghan women but men as well. So thank you for all your efforts and endeavours as well, because that contributes to our learning, and we can learn so much from you in terms of how we can push ahead and spearhead change. We've got a few minutes for questions, if we can keep you here for the next 10 minutes, Helena, if that's okay. Vanessa, you've got your hand up, so I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much indeed for your time and for addressing us with such care about the incredibly difficult situations we face. I wanted to ask you, if I may, to comment on what you think we might be able to do about the desperate state of multilateralism, and particularly, I think, the ways in which the United Nations Security Council's permanent 5 members have exonerated themselves always from the evil that they're about to do. Most recently, of course, with the terror that's unfolding in Ukraine, but unfortunately, seems to have been launched with a kind of supercharged fear at us at exactly the same time as we got 1325 passed, when Britain and the US decided to multilaterally avoid the Security Council altogether and go into Afghanistan and then Iraq, and with the horror that that's led to. And as you know, we can't get rid of them. We can't get rid of the permanent five. The system is designed in such a way that they are there in perpetuity. Do you have any thoughts about what we might be able to do?
Vanessa, thank you for coming in, and it's lovely to meet you. I share your sense of sort of depression about that this great institution brought together in the aftermath of the horrors of the Second World War, and with all that, and it's almost as if somehow the emotions that and the well, I think that kind of the sense of urgency at that time led to a belief that we had to take radical steps if we wanted to change the world. And so this structure was created, the United Nations. It was replacing the League of Nations. It was a different kind of thing, and it was and there were all those other bits that they felt should hold it in place. So organizations, the International Bar Association came into existence around the same time on the idea that we should bring lawyers together. Then there other organizations were set up that would bring doctors together, and the World Health Organization, and all these other bits which were to hold in place this sort of grand sense that we all depend on each other, and as you say, the business of internationalism, the ways in which we could only make a better world by doing it together. And of course, what we're now seeing is this fragmentation. This is one of the great things that's so depressing to me, as someone who wept over Brexit and our separation from the rest of Europe, with all its faults, from the European Union with all its faults. But you somehow have to hang on in there and believe that the only way is by doing things together. And so the arrogance and narcissism of I'm afraid, largely male politicians who end up being populist leaders, it is depressing to us. Any of us as women who who are political, I mean, say that with a small p, who have looked at the world and who have a sort of sense of where power lies and where it's failing. And we can only do that things internationally. The problem, of course, as we all know, here I've been doing some work recently around the persecution of the Uyghur in China, and I've just been sanctioned by the Chinese, so I can't go to China anymore, or Hong Kong, or to any of the places where their writ runs, nor can my children actually. So it doesn't have great consequence in my life. Unless it means that I might be arrested in one of the places that they've got extradition treaties with or something. But the reason I was doing that work, of course, was about seeing the persecution of a minority and watching and looking at the evidence as a lawyer and assessing whether I thought that there was a genocide taking place. And the problem, of course, is you can't do anything about it. China has got a veto on any case being brought to the International Court of Justice, and of course they've also got their own position sorted in relation. They never ever signed up to the Treaty of Rome for the International Criminal Court, and so the thing is not working anymore. And here is Russia again. You can't get the International Court of Justice involved. So what we're looking at, what I'm looking at just now, is how do we seek to other alternative routes? And the alternative routes, of course, have to be about setting up some kind of tribunal. Could the Council of Europe be the author of such a tribunal? Could it be that the General Assembly votes for the creation of a special tribunal, even if, it's not going to be the International Court of Justice? And so what one's looking at other forms that Kosovo had a tribunal set up, and that wasn't set up. It didn't have, it was also going to be vetoed by certainly Russia at that time. And in the same way, Sierra Leone had a tribunal at the end of the war. So we're looking now at the ways in which that could be done. But does the UN need reforming? Absolutely. Is this a good time to do it? No, it's not. And one of the reasons why is because we know that China, through its Belt and Roads policy, has indebted large parts of Africa, Pakistan, where we, the rich world, should have been helping those countries. We didn't, and so then now China is, and they're indebted. There are countries that are indebted to China, and so they were the countries that didn't vote, to denounce Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. There was abstention by so many countries, and the reason why was because of they couldn't upset China. And so at the moment, this is not a good time to seek to reform the United Nations. It's always a real catastrophe that brings the world together to try to cement better change. And so I'm afraid we're going to have to wait for the kind of change that we want, but we have to strategize on how we can do alternatively, bring together multinationals, many nations, in order to try to have justice in certain circumstances. Russia has currently just committed a crime by invading another country in the way that it has. That in itself is a crime, and it should be possible to set up a tribunal to deal with it. But it's about the mechanisms to do so that are going to be problematic for us. But I couldn't agree with you more. We do need to reform the institutions and we do need to have multilateralism. And at least Biden is back in the White House and believes in multilateralism, whereas Trump certainly didn't.
Thank you for that. You've got another question from Leslie.
Is that my friend Leslie Abbott?
Hello, Helena. Great to see you again.
It's so good to see you, and I want to.
I was going on. I agree.
No,
but
I want people to know who you are. Leslie Abdallah is one of the women in the world who has, I'm just saying, sorry, I can't take that right now. It was one of the women in Britain who really championed the business of getting more women into Parliament, because she knew that the only way that we could get real change was having more women in power and in the legislature, in order to create that change. And so she was a force to be reckoned with, and she achieved great things. So a tribute to you, Leslie.
I'm blushing, Helena. Thank you. Since we last met, I suppose I've worked in about 50 of the countries around the world on many of the issues we're talking about. And I want to try and keep it short. It's questions and provocative thoughts. 3, I think, really. You mentioned early on about women in decision-making in climate change. I think the only way we saw at COP, the few women who were at the top were mainly organizing. Somebody said to me, the coffee trolley. Not. And I think we need to put a very strict thing that at least 40 on all these treaty making, whether it's on after conflict or whether it's climate change, there must be at least 40% women and at least 40% men, and the other 20% can be blah, 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 blah. And the way we could at least start to do that is to say international organizations who mainly give the funding, and members of UN, for example, who give the funding for flights to conferences and so on and so forth, will only fund if there is that format. Now, we won't stop people talking to each other if they want to, but if they want any support funding for these things, we should make it 40%, 40%. And by saying 40% men as well as women, it gets around the thing of the women are just quota queens.
Yeah.
And I think, and it can be done under the UN CEDAW, because they have temporary special measures within CEDAW. So it fits the bill. Quite difficult to argue against. We need people like you who argue well with all the authority behind you. Quite difficult to argue against. Very simple format. And I think once it's done once or twice, it could roll. Second thing is, you mentioned the Yazidi women, and we've seen, all of us, and interviewed like you. I mean, it's heartbreaking what happens to the women in different countries conflict-related violence, sexual violence. And I think, again, there is a missing bit of this. We have the new Murad code, which is very good, from the Yazidi woman who came up with this. But the British government, at least, seems to be applying that for others who don't know, that's making everything center on the victim, the decisions. But in Britain, at least, the focus is on the children, which is fine. But the extra justice thing that's needed, as well as them seeing justice done, is the attitude to the women anywhere who've been raped in war. Very often it's the families and communities who regard them as damaged goods, ostracize them, even kill them, as though they have committed a crime. And I think we need a massive worldwide education of communities to say these women should be treated with respect and dignity, and really like military victims, veterans who get statues and pensions, as now in Kosovo got this idea of pensions for women who experience this. This is something we could all work on. And my final thing, before you come back at me, is UN. When they did the last round of UN reforms, and I remember writing something on this, the one question they didn't ask, and I think you were getting near it just now, Helena, was, if not the UN, what? Because I agree, I don't think it's fit for purpose for the world we are now in, but we do need an entity. There was League of Nations and there was UN. If not the UN, what? Let's ask these difficult questions now. So thanks, Helena. Great inspirational talk. Lovely to see you again. Now I'll hand over back to you.
No, and Leslie, 3 powerful and important points. I want to just tell people that I went up to the camps to meet the Yazidi women, and that was one of the heartbreaking things, was that the Yazidi elders really had to be persuaded, and happily they were persuaded, that the women should not be treated as though they were now contaminated, that they had been in the hands of the enemy who had done these terrible things. Many of the men were beheaded and slaughtered. Many of the boy young were destroyed too. The women, there was a sort of reluctance to let the women return, and then the leaders actually were persuaded and publicly said that the women were to be embraced and to be brought back into the community. However, the women know. And so, for example, when I spoke to some of the women about their experiences, I remember particularly talking to a woman, and she said, finding the language is hard for women talking about this when culturally it's just so not part of their way of being. And so they will often say, he made me his wife, meaning that he had intercourse with her and enslaved her. And so they would, to be made somebody's wife was the way of expressing that you had been raped. And some of the women were very unwilling to admit that they had been raped. And others who'd had children had abandoned them in camps in order to return to their families. I mean, if you're a girl of 14, 15, and then you became pregnant and so on, but they'd loved those babies. And so they were suffering serious mental repercussions. It was really traumatic sitting with those women, seeing their suffering up close, and the ways in which their community had difficulty just re-embracing them. Although the rhetoric was there, we've got to bring the girls back, there was a sense in which they were no longer the young women that they'd been before. And there was something awful about the whole atmosphere of it. And so wonderful women were working with them and doing things like sport, exercise, things to try and fill their day, and learning stuff, and learning to use sewing machines, and people had sent in, Microsoft had sent in lots of computers for them to sort of learn how to use computers. But it was really heartbreaking seeing what had happened. And it filled me with a desire to get some kind of justice. And I'm still working with people on that to try and find a way in which we could do that. I'm going to have to head off now, but I do want to say that I agree with you, Leslie, that we have to look at, are there alternatives? Are there other ways? If the UN is failing us, what can we talk about? Certainly, we're going to have to do that in relation to Ukraine. If we want to have any kind of war crimes tribunals, I don't think they're going to emanate from, we're not going to be able to use the International Court of Justice. And so how do we create some kind of reckoning with the horrors that have taken place? And then there's the issue of what's happened to many of the women, which we're learning about daily. So I'm going to leave you all, but I want to say thank you for inviting me to come along. I can see that it's an incredible gathering of folk, and I hope we can continue to work on this into the future. Suni, I have to go. I've got to go to the House of Lords because we've got. What can I tell you?
I know you're tirelessly working. I so appreciate your time, and I know we've overrun by a few minutes, but we are so grateful. Thank you for making the time for us. As always, it's inspirational, it's thought-provoking, and you leave on a note which is going to let us continue the conversation, and I'm sure, and I will feed back to you in due course. But thank you so much. It's just been wonderful as always having you here.
It's great to see you all. All the best. Bye.
Thanks. Bye. So, Ali, I believe that we have now the next, our first panel. Is that right?
Yeah, I think we have, I hope, a short break. And we just tried to build those in, coffee, food, bathroom break. So I would just, if you can, just leave the link open and you can turn off cameras and stuff, and then we'll come back and have our first full panel. Does that sound good? And as always,